What's up guys? In today's video, I'm going to be showing you guys how to improve your 3D renders inside Cinema 4D. Let's go! So it's Takumi here from Studio TikTak, and the main gist will be inside physical render or your standard render within Cinema 4D. But everything I'll show in this video will apply to any 3D program, so even if you're using Blender, Maya, maybe 3ds Max, these knowledge will carry on. So stick with it, and then hopefully you can get something good out of it. Let's get to it. So main thing that really gets your 3D scenes to be super strong is really all about the lighting, and this applies no matter what kind of software you're in, no matter what kind of render you're using. Understanding bases of lighting and photography really takes you far inside 3D. So some things I quickly recommend to just get fast quick previews is that start with like a smaller render resolution inside your scene, and your final render could be 1920 by 1080, especially if you're starting out, is totally okay. Don't feel like you have to render out things in 4K because it will slow you down significantly, and if you're starting out, like, it fucking sucks to waste your like fucking valuable hours into just waiting for like the renders and the pixelation to calculate, so don't do it. And then for your final render, just so you have more latitude, I do recommend for you to use 16-bit TIFF. It really gives the flexibility in the post-processing, and also rendering things out with straight alpha is pretty nice to be able to like change your background even in animation to like adjust stuff inside After Effects. So I do recommend that. So just as an example, your render settings inside Cinema, I do start with physical, and then really turning on the global illumination and an ambient occlusion inside your settings. You could leave these at the default setting, but I do recommend that just to get the looks down. But maybe use like 800 and then the height of 450. 72 dpi is totally fine if you use 300 more time to calculate your image, but obviously if you're printing, sometimes 300 necessary. But for working renders, when you're just previewing file, hitting Command R or Option R for you Windows folks, and then start with like maybe a PNG and an 8-bit. Like, it is your preference, but I do recommend 8-bit just so your rendering can process faster. And as for your final output settings, I totally think 1920 and 1080 is okay. And then make sure you have your global illumination and ambient occlusion checked in, as long as it works with your scene. Sometimes you have it off, like it all depends on the scene. 72 is totally okay, especially if you're posting stuff on the web. And then I do recommend going 16-bit, and then TIFF is a format that's pretty easy, fairly uncompressed, like easy to navigate. I recommend using that. Next thing, a few terminology things. If you're not aware of what global illumination is, so it's essentially basically a group of algorithms used in 3D computer graphics that are meant to add realistic lighting scenes to your 3D scenes. Basically how like light bounces in the 3D world, and it's also referred to as indirect lighting. So like, as you can see, we have the green wall on the right side and the orange wall on the left side, and we can see that the orange is casted on this circle here. Circle, that's not the right term. A sphere, yeah. Sphere here, and you also see the green here, and as it's closer to the green wall, the green is like much more relevant, permanent, like it shows up more. And then you can see the same thing here, the red casted on the sphere, and we also see it here. Really enabling ambient occlusion makes your scene so much more realistic with one click of a button. So if you have not done so, I highly recommend it. And then another thing is ambient occlusion. So alongside global illumination, ambient occlusion is like basically the shading technique used in renders. So as we can kind of see here, I would think of it as like a corner of a room, or when two surfaces meet, we see that shadow in between. And then so it's basically how computer calculates your shadows, and it's ambient lighting. So we see all the dark spots here. These are what the ambient occlusion is. So in different programs, I believe like Unity calls it like visual ambient occlusion or something. Cinema 40, NC 40 is just ambient occlusion, so you can totally use that setting on, which is dope. So as you can see, like with and without, like you see the realism added to your 3D render, which is so big. And then HDRIs. So many people are not aware how to use HDRIs, and it's like pretty dope. It's basically a dynamic 360 lighting. And then in the native renderer inside Cinema 4D, you can either use the sky, physical sky, or actually create your own. Another plugin that you could use to go with it is the GSG Grayscale Real. Shout out to the HDRI Studio Kit. It makes the process instant. So HDRI is like high dynamic range imaging. So it's stacked from underexposed, normally exposed to overexposed images, and then it creates an HDRI picture, but it's in 360. So it kind of looks like this in a flat format. And then when it's applied to your 3D scene, it automatically lights your scene up. So combining these techniques of HDRI, ambient occlusion, and global illumination, you get fantastic results. It might take a little longer to render these out, but you do get amazing results. So here I'm just showing you guys a few examples of it. And then let me launch Cinema 4D here. I have OBS, C4D, and InDesign opening all at once on my MacBook Pro. RIP, I can't wait for the next machine. If I don't have so many things open at once, it's usually not as slow as this. So as we can see here, we got our scene with the two Daft Punk figures. Shout out to Daft Punk, RIP, much love for them. But I'm gonna drop, like I said in my tutorial, to my render settings to something much lower. So I'm gonna lock the ratio and maybe even go like 500 and then 280. That's totally cool. I have global illumination and ambient occlusion as like just default settings, and then I could hit Command R. It's preparing to calculate. It might be slow here, of course, because we have no lights. Duh. So I added a basic spotlight, and I'm gonna put that here, and then this is without global illumination and ambient occlusion. So super dark, not enough light. So the model itself is pretty good, so we're getting something decent, but obviously like this isn't enough lighting for anything. So what I will do is actually go to my here, add a sky in my scene, and that should give me a nice HDR image that's already built inside Cinema 4D. And even at this level of rendering here, you could already tell that like, oh yeah, this looks pretty sweet. Like it looks much more natural. You could already tell that even though the model is pretty good and textured, looks much more realistic. And then go inside my settings. Oh, and then I already had global illumination and ambient occlusion on, so my bad guys. Let me turn these settings off, and then I will hit the render region. Yeah, render region. and just render this. So this is without ambient occlusion and ambient global illumination, and like it's much more flat. You don't see as much more of the details. But by going here, turning on that ambient occlusion, then we hit Option R. So I hit render region here, and you could see the small images here. That's making the scene much more realistic. Just super dope. Yeah, pretty easy settings to make your renders much more realistic. Like you could see in between the arms and where the helmet and the shadow is, like you could see all the shadows that's becoming more prominent, and that's really important to get your 3D renders looking much more realistic. And then another thing that a lot of people actually don't know about is you could take a sphere in your 3D scene, just make it huge, and then create a new material, and underneath the luminance channel here, you could enable it, which luminance channel, it's about the lighting, and you could load a 360, your own HDRI image in here. So what I'll do, I'll go to my desktop, and then yeah, let's take this scenic HDRI image. The more higher resolution you have is better, but this will do the job. And then now, and then you actually, I just made my own HDRI, and what I can do is plug that texture into my 3D scene, and boom, ooh, where'd my models go? And boom, that's how you create your own HDRI. Super easy. If you have like an Insta360 One X, you can actually create your own HDRI, which is like mind-blowing to me. The fact that like there's multiple ways to do it. Like you can take like a camera and a tripod and like shoot it and stitch it together in Photoshop. That's one tactic. But even with that, you could see the reflectance of the buildings, and like you could already tell where it's going. Where when you have a real 3D lighting, it makes your actual 3D renderings realistic. Pretty cool. Alright, and then of course the popular, I can go to my extensions, HDRI Browse Studio Rig, and then, you know, like it's basically, it automates the system for you. So that's how I got some of the lighting in my final images. So like paying for plugins, like it's not always cool to do, but it does speed up your workflow, and you get much more realistic results quicker, and that's why we pay for plugins. But it's totally not necessary when you're starting out, and I would actually argue that it's better not to be paying for plugins because you have more of an understanding in 3D. So let's get back to InDesign. Camera settings. This is a really overlooked topic inside Cinema 4D. The default camera settings inside Cinema is 35mm, and if you know photography, you can experiment with this. Yeah, so like a wider focal lengths like 16mm can really make your scene look dynamic, while like something more standard would be like 35-50, and then like more macro shots and compress will be anything above 70mm and 100. Like 85 would be like a really popular portrait look. And so if you don't know about cameras, like you could tell 18 is wider, 15 is more traditional, and then like 200, 300 is much more compressed. So if I can look into my scene, I'll enable my camera, and then this basically, we have it, it's 35mm. Let me go inside my camera. This is 35. If I change my focal length to 24, oh, it's wider, 16mm. And you could tell that this looks much more dynamic, and it looks cool. And Beeple does this a lot too, like lots of 3D artists do it. And then if you go into like a 85, which is like much more tied up macro shots, you could see that this render, like right here, it's hard to navigate because we're in a tighter focal length. But you could tell this is more of a portrait look. And if you want to go back wider, maybe a 50, 24, and then you can get closer to it. This can look more dynamic, but your space, the way it's compressed, would be different. But leaving it at default in 35 is okay, but make sure that's another easy thing that won't add to your render times that you can really experiment with inside your cinema. And then post-processing, I would say this would be the biggest part of making your render looks that much better, like improving it. So almost every render that you see posted on like Behance, Pinterest, Instagram, whatever, is post-processed. It's either inside After Effects, Photoshop, and Nuke. That's another advanced software that we won't get into. And then using a high bit depth allows color for more color manipulation. So like if you know about video, like 8-bit footage, when you're color grading, it breaks much easier. It doesn't retain as much color information. It gets much noisier. Using 16-bit, 32-bit, like more uncompressed, will give you much better results. Another trick that I like to do inside Photoshop for still images is adding fake depth of field in post. You can use the effects like field blur, lens blur, and iris blur. And then noise, chromatic aberration, and adjusting your vibrance. Usually with Cinema 4D's physical render, my color results isn't always as vibrant, so I usually add some vibrance inside Photoshop. And then adding like chromatic aberration, noise, like these imperfections is what prevents it from your work from looking too digital and too clean, and it just adds much more reality, like a film photography would. So this is something that I do, like straight out of Cinema 4D without depth of field looks like this, but I add field blur inside Photoshop and makes it much more like appealing to the eye. And another trick that I use, like Cinema 4D straight out here, and then after post-processing, the fact that I render it out with like an alpha channel allows me to add this background element. And then also this trick, taking the highlight, adding Gaussian blur, like really blooming the highlights, is another trick that I love to use. So if I can close my cinema for a second, and we're gonna hop inside Photoshop to show you some of these tricks. And let me close Cinema 4D just to save up on that RAM, you know. Come on, Photoshop. Alright. So now that we're inside Photoshop, so this is a render that I did out of Cinema 4D in 16-bit TIFF, and then rendered out with straight alpha. So first thing, I just duplicate my layer, and then I go in, add some vibrance, just to get that color to pop. And then you could tell at this point, like the colors, like so much more different, much more vibrant compared to this. It's much more dual, but now we got some like energy going back into this render. And then you could tell that all these elements, it's so sharp and it's not necessarily appealing to the eye. So I would hit Option Command E, Option Command Shift E, or merge all layers. Then I would go into my effects panel and then add a filter, blur. You could add these blur, but I go into my blur gallery and I love field blur or iris blur. Iris is more related to photography, so it is in my range. So maybe we can take this here. So I'm actually going to enable iris blur here. And then so I get this round element, and then I'm gonna center that element here, and then change the blur angle. Screen recording this and using Photoshop, C4D, and InDesign totally just destroys the graphics in my MacBook. This is what I was trying to show you guys here. Add some vibrance. You can go in hue adjustment layer and then change the colors. It's a really easy way to like just experiment, especially for renders that like are more abstract. You didn't care about the colors. All the depth of field, low aperture stuff, super appealing to the eye. And then for something like this, adjust the background, like manipulate the colors, maybe add some logo, adding type on top, like use your graphic design skills. And then the way I did these blooms, I extracted the highlights and then added Gaussian below, and then layer that merge layer on top. So that's another technique to really bring your post-processing game for your 3D world. Yeah, so that's pretty much it. I know it was a long video. I hope you guys enjoyed it. This is like my first tutorial in a long time, so if you have any tips, like please help me, and then I want to help you guys. And then please join my Discord. We discuss and share work. We're really boosting each other up. That's it for me today. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you guys in the next video.